Our century has been marked by the most vicious, brutal, senseless, and destructive wars of human history. At the same time, man is touting his intellectual achievements. He's touting his independence from God. I'm Julius Smetona. This is what Catholics believe. In 1917, the Mother of God, in an apparition at Fatima, Portugal, told 3 children that wars are a punishment for sin. And she predicted the Second World War and these tremendous emergence of machines of massive destruction. What do Catholics believe about grace and sin? With us today is Father William Jenkins, pastor of St. Teresa of the Child Jesus Church in Parma, Ohio, and principal of St. Gertrude's Academy in Cincinnati. Father, welcome to our show.
Thank you, James.
Father, do you believe that, or how is this connection between these tremendous disasters such as World War II, utter senseless wars such as World War I, and sin? Is there any tie-in? It doesn't seem that the two would be at all connected.
Well, the Blessed Mother said that war was a punishment for sin. That's exactly right. Sin is the evil in the world today. The volcanoes and the drought that we're facing right now, and the greenhouse effect, and all the rest of that is nothing but the result of a sinful humanity. And we have to begin to face the fact that we punish ourselves by our sins and for our sins, for rebelling against God.
So, God sends wars to punish man for sin.
Absolutely. God does not create the wars, but God allows us, by the withdrawal of His grace, to be so consumed with our own pride and avarice that war then becomes inevitable.
So let me ask you then, you mentioned grace. What is grace?
Grace is a supernatural help from God. It is what promotes in us virtue or strength of character, to do the right thing, to do what is good.
So when you said that God, to punish man, withdraws from him his grace, it seems that without divine assistance, man will descend lower than the brute beast and will become an absolutely horrendous creature.
Because of original sin, and because of the way man is created, when he goes bad, he does not simply become an animal, which does not have a soul. Man becomes a devil. He becomes a demon. And he is capable of the most terrible, terrible evils. He's capable of hatred, so destructive that he can throw a switch and in an instant incinerate hundreds or thousands of people and not care.
Let's get back to the first point then, the first part of the first point, original sin. Was that the first sin ever committed?
Original sin was, as its name implies, the first sin committed by the human race. Lucifer, of course, of the angelic nature, committed the first sin against God in rebelling and not being obedient to God. But on earth, Adam and Eve committed the first sin, which we call original sin. We have inherited from that. We have inherited that sin from them by the human nature that we've received from them.
What were Adam and Eve like when they were created before they, as you say, rebelled against God?
Adam and Eve were created in innocence and in grace. They were given special privileges by God: immortality, impassibility, infused knowledge. They were like perfect human beings. But they still had in them a certain pride of life, which proved to be their ultimate downfall.
What's this pride of life you mentioned?
The pride of life is the desire for independence, the desire to make up for their own mind, make up for themselves their own rules of right and wrong. They would do what they wanted without any outside restraints.
So this isn't part of original sin, then, this pride of life?
That pride of life is something that you might say is in our nature. And it did follow from original sin. But as long as man remained in grace, it would be turned to something good, and he would value himself as God valued him, as a creature of God, and he would look for all of the good that was in him as the product of God's own goodness. But as soon as he asserted that independence and decided to declare for himself that he was to be the measure of his own life, his own right and wrong, that is when he committed original sin.
What were Adam and Eve like before they fell? How were they compared to us?
Well, it would be the difference between night and day.
Were they more intelligent than modern?
We would today consider them to be supermen. By their infused knowledge, by their inability to suffer injury, by their immortality, all of these privileges given to them by God, not demanded by our nature, but privileges given by God, we would consider them to be supermen.
Even on a physical side, they would probably, would you say, have been perfectly proportioned and have even on the physical side?
They would have been the ideal human being, the idealized human being. And you would have found that mirrored in the Blessed Virgin Mary while she was on earth.
What was then the nature of this first transgression against the law of God by Adam and Eve? How did they fall? How did they transgress his law?
Well, they were tempted by the devil to disobey him. God forbade them to eat of the fruit of a certain tree in the Garden of Eden. And Eve listened to the serpent, and she did eat of it. And she ate of it because she was told by the serpent that if she did eat of that fruit, she would be like God herself, knowing good and evil. In other words, she would be independent of God and would be her own God. And she took that fruit and she went to Adam, and at the inducement of Eve, he ate also, and their eyes were opened. And they had fallen from grace, and the world changed. The world was changed.
What was the change that was effected in them the moment they committed this transgression?
They had a whole category enter their way of thinking, and that was the whole idea of evil. The whole idea of disorder suddenly appeared before them. What they had done and the way it affected all of creation. The very concept of disorder and evil was not to be found in their minds until that moment. But once they disobeyed God, that opened up the whole realm of chaos and disorder and rebellion.
To what extent are we infected by this disorder and chaos which entered into their minds and hearts?
Well, as St. Paul says, we find in ourselves a battle going on. Now, this all sounds very remote. We talk about the book of Genesis, we talk about grace, we talk about the serpent in the garden. It all may sound very remote. In fact, we live with this every single day of our lives, in every single decision that we make. There are moral consequences to every decision that we make. And we have to decide whether we are going to do the right thing or not. We live with the consequences of this one action of Adam and Eve. There are those today who poo-poo the idea of original sin and say, oh, well, that's just an old fable. Wrong. But we look at the way the world is today, a world torn by strife, enmity, pride, and all of the other capital sins. We see a world that has definitely fallen. It was not the way it was created to be. And we can see in ourselves the consequences of original sin when we find the constant struggle between doing what is comfortable and doing what is right.
Father, you mentioned the idea of poo-pooing original sin. Well, it seems to me that even on the American political scene, certain movements characterize this poo-pooing, and I'll specifically mention such organizations like the Libertarian Party, where they will say, well, if man wants to, drink alcohol, or if he wants to do such and such a thing, or buy pornography, let him. If they want to put advertisements on television, no one's forcing you to watch those. Why can't you control yourself? All this seems to indicate that they don't believe that man has a wounded nature, or even if there is an objective right and wrong. What's your feeling on
Well, the Libertarian Party often confuses itself with more conservative movements today, and that's not true. The liberal movements of the Enlightenment and that followed on the Enlightenment all had the idea of breaking free of law from God. And the liberal ideas all were that every man should be a law to himself and do whatever he wants to do as long as he doesn't hurt anybody else. Well, that's the libertarian idea right there. They're not conservative. They're the liberals, the quintessential liberals. We, who believe that man has a soul and that his soul is subject to God, who is the creator and the lawgiver, must say that that libertarian idea is absolute heresy. We could have nothing to do with it. As a matter of fact, that was the doctrine of Lucifer in the Garden of Eden. That's what induced man to degrade himself in the first place. Our dignity will be found in our conformity, the conformity of our wills, with the law of God, with right and wrong. We were not created to do whatever we feel was right or wrong. We have to conform ourselves to a divinely given order in this world. That will be our dignity, and that will be our salvation.
Father, how does then grace enter into the picture? What is the relationship then between sin and grace? When did grace come to be?
Grace came to be when God created man. You see, grace is a supernatural help from God as an actual grace, but there is such a thing as sanctifying grace also. And sanctifying grace is the sharing in the life of God. Now, when God created Adam and Eve, he created them in sanctifying grace. They already had a share in his supernatural life.
What is this share in the supernatural life? What do you mean by we share in his life?
That means we are considered to be children of God, that we are just and right in his eyes, and that we have in ourselves that which, when we die, will call upon God to actually give us the beatific vision. That is the very sight of God, the very sharing in the supernatural life of God in heaven. We already do that on earth through sanctifying grace. Father Garrigou-Lagrange said that sanctifying grace is like the seed of eternity in our souls, whereby we will be united to the supernatural and infinite life of God.
You know, Father, I recall reading a statement by St. Paul and a commentary on it, in fact, by the same Father Garrigou-Lagrange. St. Paul said that he cannot do, or he finds in himself that which opposes what he would do. In other words, he cannot do what he wishes to do because there's this something which opposes him. Now, is this something, would you call this is this original sin?
These are the consequences of original sin within it, yes. There is an inclination toward disorder and evil, an inclination toward selfishness, which will lead us to sacrifice the good of others and even the honor of God for our own pleasure.
I think that even in the modern men will not deny this, that if you hear, for instance, no one likes to hear of someone's successes. If someone comes up and tells you, oh, he's doing so well, you'll say, ah. But then if someone says, do you know what he did? Oh, let me tell you this, and it's a horrible scandal, man is instantly, he perks up and he wants to listen. Is this part of original sin?
It absolutely is. When you pick up a newspaper, if there's a lurid scandal on the front page, 90% of the eyes that first look at the front page are going to go to that article. People are drawn to this. They are drawn to this in the movie theaters also. The lurid reports. Look at the advertisements for the movies that come out. The more lurid they can make them, even movies that are G and PG, the more lurid they can make them sound, the more people will come and watch them. People love this. They wallow in it. Horror movies are another thing. For some reason, people love to go and get the living daylights scared out of them, or to be, quote, grossed out, unquote, by blood and gore. Why is that? What is this fascination with violence and lust? It's the result of original sin. And it's the same evil that drags people out onto the battlefield and leads them to kill each other and use each other as means to their own ends. We find in so many of the so-called religions in the world, they actually look upon men as a means to an end. Look at the terrorists over in the Middle East. They'll blow up an entire plane load of people. And all because those people are not looked upon as created in the image and likeness of God, having immortal souls, those people are looked upon by the Muslim terrorists as simply pawns or means to an end to create terror, to compel governments to grant them their wishes. This is all the result of original sin.
What happens to a person? How does a person obtain grace?
First of all, he has to will it. There has to be an actual grace from God moving him, moving his will to want to be in the grace of God. And if one cooperates with that initial grace that comes from God, that actual grace that first gives him that impulse to do what is right, and he follows through on it, then through the sacraments, through an act of charity, an act of love for God, he receives sanctifying grace, which gives him that share in the life of God. And if one dies with sanctifying grace in his soul, that is, in the friendship of God, then he ultimately will be taken to heaven by God. The light of glory will be infused in his soul. He will be a child of God, and he will have a part in the supernatural life of God forever. He will see God face to face.
When you say that man has to receive a grace from God to even make a movement towards that which is good, you're saying that man is then helpless without him. What if God doesn't send man this grace?
If God does not send man this grace, then man must have rejected grace at one time or another. You know, there comes a point when, after God has tried to move a soul in the direction of what is right, and tried in vain, that God will remove the grace, and that person's soul will harden. The soul of Pharaoh in the Old Testament was a good example of that. He resisted the grace of God out of pride for so long that God simply removed from him the grace and light that he would give to a cooperative soul. And Pharaoh's soul was hardened. And we see where it led. It led to his own destruction. You know, there's a saying among pagans that those whom the gods will destroy, they first make mad. And so there's a certain parallel here, that when a soul resists the actual grace that God sends over a period of time, then God will withdraw that grace. And the soul will be hardened, and that person will then be headlong, bound for his own destruction.
Now, it seems that even more so than the evangelists, St. Paul keeps referring to this tremendous struggle going in within man. He says how the old man and the new man are always at odds and fighting with each other. The old man being the man of original sin, the new man being the child of grace through the passion of Christ. How does this work on the practical order? Let me give you an example. Say the inspirations or the subtle inspirations of the Holy Ghost. Say someone, you look at something and you say, well, I really shouldn't take that thing. But then you feel another voice within you say, yes, but if you take that thing, you'll be much happier. And one voice says, gives you a warning that, you know, you really shouldn't do that, and yet you feel this urge to do it. And then, well, more often than not, the second urge wins out and you take it. This is something which I'm sure most people experience many times a day. Is this the battle of grace, between grace and natural man?
It's the battle between grace and fallen nature, exactly. You know, sometimes you'll find a hardened sinner who repents and converts, changes his life, and he becomes every bit as good as he had been bad. And he loves with this intensity those things which he once hated with intensity. How is this possible? Well, it's the result of prayer. Someone, somewhere, is praying and sacrificing for them. Say, for example, you find someone who's living in adultery, and he knows better. And you know he knows better, but he makes all kinds of excuses, justifying it in his own mind. That person has never really come to terms with the sin. And you see it in little ways here and there. Sooner or later, if he persists in doing what is wrong, God may well simply withdraw the grace from him. But there will be others who happen to love that person, who will pray for him and sacrifice for him. And you'll find down the road, perhaps years later, that person who is hardened in sin, suddenly seemingly running into a brick wall. It's as though God stored up that grace for years, waiting just for the right moment. And then just at the right moment, God gives this massive infusion of grace to that soul. And it works an incredible change in a person's way of thinking.
When man has this urge from his corrupt nature to do something, and he has this inspiration not to do it, why is it that the second one wins out? Is it because God didn't give him enough grace? Is it because his will wasn't strong enough?
God will always give sufficient grace where there no opposition in the soul. Okay? If the individual's will was not set against what God's grace is telling him, sufficient grace would move him to do the right thing. But there are times when God will give what is called efficient grace. And efficient grace overcomes all obstacles, even the resistance of the will. The conversion of St. Paul, again, is a prime example of that. Paul, who was hardened against Catholicism, and who was going to Damascus to bring back in chains those who worshipped our Lord Jesus Christ. He was thrown down from his horse and blinded. That is a very telling operation of efficient grace. Now you may say, well, if anyone were knocked off his horse and blinded, no matter how hardened he was, he would have converted. Well, you know, there are some people who would have just stood up there and cursed God for doing this. They're so obstinate, so full of spite, that it's not that they don't believe in God, it's that they believe in him intensely, but they hate what he does because of their own pride. But St. Paul was given the efficient grace to be thrown down, and he received the interior grace to change his ways and to accept what God was doing to him. We as Catholics believe that if one dies without sanctifying grace in his soul, that is, as an enemy of God, rebelling against the law of God, that person will be condemned to hell. That will be the result of sin, death, eternal death. But that if one dies in the state of sanctifying grace, in the state of friendship with God, loving God at least more than himself, and therefore, when it comes down to a choice of deciding between what God wants and what I want, doing what God wants and sacrificing my own will, if one dies in that state of sanctifying grace, that he will be rewarded with supernatural life and live forever in the company of God.
Father, you mentioned that if others pray for an individual, if others offer sacrifices for that individual, he may receive grace from God. And this is in fact what the Mother of God said at Fatima, that you must pray and sacrifice. How does this work? How is it that God, if you make some kind of a sacrifice, meaning a sacrifice of your own will, and you say a prayer, a Hail Mary, how is it that God will then give that person grace?
Well, a sacrifice is an act of love toward God. It's an act of love for God rather than love for self. Okay? We read in the Gospels about the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven. Well, in that kingdom, the coin of the realm is love, is charity, love for God, which expresses itself in sacrifice. Our Lord once said that if you should so much as give a cup of cold water to a little one for love of him, you would not lose your reward. God keeps track even of things like that, a cup of cold water. Even though you may forget when you die that you gave a cup of cold water to a little one, God will not forget, ever. And he will reward you for that someday. And so when you make a sacrifice, no matter how small it may appear to be, no matter how insignificant, and in fact the devil tries to convince you it's too insignificant, God won't care. But no matter how insignificant it is, God will remember that, and he will reward you And he will use that act of love that you perform for the benefit of some other soul on earth, even some poor sinner on the other side of the world who may live years from now. And he will use that to try to pull them out of their misery, pull them out of their sin, and give them faith, hope, and charity.
Father, the last thing I'd like to ask you is we see that the movie and entertainment industry appeals to these things of fallen human nature, and yet when anyone would say that, well, you shouldn't write about such things, you shouldn't print such things in the newspaper, they say this is censorship. You have to control yourself. You can't impose censorship. This leads to all government and tyranny. How would you respond to this?
Censorship should be leveled against things that are evil and disordered. The same people who are saying that would not have banana peels and coffee grounds dumped on their carpet. Why dump the same trash in their minds? That's what they're doing to the children when they talk about censorship. We have an obligation to censor what is evil. Julius, the whole history of the world is a history of the conflict between sin and grace, between pride and humility or obedience to God. All the wars and all are an expression of that. We have to understand that, get at the root of the problem, and we have to pray and sacrifice to God so that God will drag this world, lift this world out of its misery.
Father, thank you very much for being with us.